Alright, y'all, we're back. Today we will be focused on chapter 16, The Crisis of Union. So, let's get it going. Okay. Alright, so chapter 16, The Crisis of Union. Y'all, we talked about it basically at the end of chapter 15. What we saw is that Polk thought getting all this land would ultimately unite the country, and all it really does is actually increase the fighting, increase the debate, increase the issues regarding around the issue of slavery. So as we get through the 1950s, as we go through the 1850s, what we have to look at is just this constant battle, this constant issue, constant debate over slavery is just building and building and building. And eventually, as we get to the election of 1860, and then ultimately, beginning in 1861, it climaxes and we begin the Civil War. Okay? So, but how do we go from being a nation that is this manifest destiny, conquer the continent, and everything's going great in that regard, at least for white Americans, right? Everything's going great, we're conquering the continent, to going ahead and fighting each other in the Civil War. What leads up to that? Basically, what happens in the decade of the 1850s to lead us to that, right? So, let's take a look. Slavery in the territories. We've got all this new land, right? So we acquired Texas, we acquired California, the New Mexico area, which again today is modern day New Mexico and Arizona. Nevada's in the mix as well. The Oregon territory. We have everything below the 49th parallel, right? What are we doing with all of this territory? Is slavery going to be allowed? Okay. So remember, as we said at the end of the Mexican War, it would cause more trouble. Oftentimes, because wars often cause more war, right? We see that a lot of people will tell you if you take history of 256, the stuff at the end of World War I led to World War II, right? And so oftentimes war causes, we think one war is going to settle something, but sometimes it leads to more conflict later on. So when we look at this slavery in the territory, what we got to pay attention to is the Wilmot Proviso. In 1846, actually during the Mexican War, we get the Wilmot Proviso. What it was is that David Wilmot proposed a bill in the House of Representatives to ban slavery in any territory the U.S. gained from Mexico. Okay, so Wilmot Proviso was basically, we're going to ban slavery in any territory we gain from this war with Mexico. Y'all, twice it passed the House, but it always failed in the Senate. Okay, it failed, but the idea stayed very prominent in politics. As a rebuttal, John Calhoun came up with what's known as the Calhoun Resolutions. Okay, and he proposed it in the Senate. So Calhoun is in the Senate, and Calhoun is championing the cause of slavery. David Wilmot here is in the House of Representatives, and he's promoting the idea of not allowing slavery. Not necessarily, and this is something I want you to keep in mind as we move through this and as we move into the Civil War. Understand this, y'all. Not everybody who wanted to not everybody who was against slavery was always against it, or was thought was in support of keeping slavery out of an area because of their racial ideas. Understand this, y'all. There's a difference between being an abolitionist and being anti-slavery. So being an abolitionist, you wanted to end slavery, get rid of it, end it altogether. Being anti-slavery, you didn't want to see slavery spread. You weren't trying to eliminate it where it was, but you didn't want to see it spread, right? So we start to see some of these different ideas, in essence, some nuance to these arguments. There are people who are pro-slavery, people who are anti-slavery because they don't want to see slavery spread into areas, and then there are people who are abolitionists who ultimately want to get rid of slavery altogether everywhere in the nation. And sometimes those lines between anti-slavery and abolitionists, they get blurred. But just kind of keep that in mind. A lot of people are looking at, they don't have a problem with, a lot of people who are anti-slavery don't have a problem with slavery in the South. They have a problem with slavery expanding. That's their big issue. Because they don't want to see slavery spread. Remember, what does slavery do to wages? It drives wages down. So people who are out there working don't get paid as much because they can't work as cheap as a slave, right? We've talked about that before, so I'll move on. But anyway, the Wilmot Proviso. During the Mexican War in 1846, David Wilmot proposed a bill in the House of Representatives to ban slavery in any territory gained from Mexico. Twice it passed the House, but it failed in the Senate. It failed, but the idea stayed prominent in politics. As a rebuttal, John Calhoun came up with what we know as the Calhoun Resolutions, and he proposed it in the Senate. And it said, the Calhoun Resolution said that to prevent any person from taking their slaves west would be to deny him the Fifth Amendment. Yo, let's look at that. The Fifth Amendment forbids Congress to deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Okay? He says slaves were property and therefore could not be denied. Okay? Yo, when we look at this, this is not going to be accepted on a national level. But Calhoun is making a very legally articulate argument here. Yo, he's arguing for slavery. None of us can sit here, I especially, would not sit here and say that, oh, it's a good argument. No, yo, I don't mean it's a good argument. What I mean is that he's making a technically legal argument and trying to make it, he's trying to use technicalities to justify beliefs, right? So, in essence, he's not making a morally good argument, but from a legal standpoint, he's making an argument that, by the logic of the day, has some merit. Okay? Now, it shouldn't. Slavery's bad. We know that. Let me be clear on that. Slavery is bad. I'm not supporting it in any way, shape, or form. What Calhoun does, though, is he finds a way to craft an argument that will ultimately become the basis of the Southern argument moving forward. Y'all, using the Fifth Amendment, y'all, remember, how were slaves treated at this time? How were slaves viewed? Slaves were viewed as property, right? So, again, I'm not comparing a person to a car, but in essence, I am. Y'all, today, is there any law that states you can't take your car across a state line? No, there's not, right? But what we see here is ultimately that Calhoun's saying, well, there's no difference between my buggy, my horse and carriage, and my slave. They are both my property, so I can take them wherever I want, because the Fifth Amendment guarantees me the right that Congress, and no person in this country can deprive me of my life, my liberty, or my property without due process of law. Without convicting me of a crime, you cannot take away my property. That's what the Fifth Amendment says, and that's the basis of the argument that Calhoun uses. And again, this is not accepted on a national level, because a lot of people recognize, that's not like slaves. There's a difference in slaves, and there's a difference in slave property and your horse and buggy, right? That there is and there should be a difference in that. And so it's not going to be accepted on a national level, but it becomes the basis of the Southern argument, okay? Now, what we see is that we have the issue of what to do with all this area. Is it going to be slave? Is it going to be free, right? The Wilmot Proviso didn't pass. Calhoun's resolutions aren't accepted nationwide. So what are we going to do? How is this land going to be decided? So we get the idea of popular sovereignty. Lewis Cass supported this. He suggested this idea. He argued that the citizens of the territory should decide for themselves what should happen in certain areas. This idea would gain a lot of support and become a big issue in the election of 1848. So when you get to that election, it will be a big issue, but popular sovereignty, Lewis Cass says, the population of an area should be sovereign. The people who live in that area should decide. Somebody from Virginia shouldn't decide what happens in Idaho. What happens in Vermont the people in Vermont shouldn't decide what happens in New Mexico, right? The people of that region should decide for themselves. Okay, so again, popular sovereignty, Lewis Cass, the people, the population of a region, the populace of a region, the citizens of a territory should decide for themselves what should happen in certain areas. Again, this is going to become a big issue in the election of 1848. Now, also in 1848, we have the question of Oregon. Okay, so in 1848, we have the question of Oregon. Many felt it should be free, and some thought slave. Now Polk settles this when he decides it will be a free territory. It's not a state yet. Polk quickly decides here in 1848, look, Oregon is going to be a free territory. Why? Because of the Missouri Compromise line of 3630, right? We had the Missouri Compromise line from a while back. Remember Henry Clay's, one of his first big band-aids We see it popping up here again. Simply put, Polk looks at it and says, Missouri Compromise said no slavery above the 3630 line, which is Missouri southern border. So if Missouri southern border is here and Oregon is up here, there's no doubt Oregon is above the 3630 line, so slavery can't exist. So Polk makes a quick decision on that. Okay? So now we move on. Okay? So that brings us to the election of 1848. Polk promised to serve only one term, and he felt he accomplished all he set out to do, so he steps down. Okay? So Polk had made a promise he was only going to serve one term, which is really odd when you think about how he was worried about like Winfield Scott, and eventually he becomes worried about Zachary Taylor as political threats because he basically promised to serve one term. He accomplished everything he set out to do, so he steps down. Now the Whigs nominate Zachary Taylor. He's from Louisiana, slave owner, big war hero. He's new to politics, y'all. Zachary Taylor had actually never voted in a national election until he runs for president. Like the first time he votes in a national election is when he's running for president. That's just simply astounding, right? So the Whigs nominate Zachary Taylor. He's from Louisiana. He's not originally from Louisiana, but he was he had a residence in Louisiana. He's a slave owner, big war hero, and again, he's new to politics, which means if he's new to politics, he hasn't made a lot of enemies, right? Now, the Democrats, before I move on, Zachary Taylor, and the Whigs, again, have no major platform, just like in 1840. No major platform, just like in 1840. Again, this idea of, if we don't say anything, we can't say the wrong thing. If I don't say anything at all, I can't say the wrong thing. That's what the Whigs go with here in 1840. The Democrats are going to nominate Lewis Cass. He supports popular sovereignty, and they hope winning the war will get the party reelected. So what we see is that Polk resigns, the Whigs nominate Zachary Taylor, and the Democrats are like, well, we had a guy who could have run. Polk could have run for re-election because he was doing great, but he decides not to run. And so Lewis Cass is their nominee, and they hope that winning the war will ultimately get them reelected. But we also have a third party, the Free Soil Party. The big deal, free soil was a big deal because many people were focused on that concept rather than abolition. Again, y'all, this idea of free soil. Rather than abolishing slavery everywhere, many people are anti-slavery. They are free soils. They want all of this new land to be free. Okay? They don't want any slave states. Again, these free soilers are very much people we would classify in that anti-slavery category. We don't have to abolish it. We're not saying, hey, get rid of slavery in the South. Southerners, we're not telling you got to get rid of slavery. We're just saying we don't want it to spread. You can keep it. We just don't want it to spread, right? So, in essence, trying to play nice with Southern slave owners, but still keep free states on the free states keep the number of free states increasing because they wanted more free land, more free soil, right? So, many people were focused on free soil rather than abolition. They want to let the whites have the land and keep blacks out. They don't have to discuss slavery if it's not allowed. Like, that's their big thing. If this is a free state and slavery is not allowed, we don't have to discuss it. But if we go with popular sovereignty, like Lewis Cass and the Democrats are suggesting, then we have the debate over whether slavery can be allowed. If we just don't allow slavery, we don't have to discuss it. And ultimately, we can keep African Americans out. Okay? They want to let the whites have the land and keep the blacks out. Don't have to discuss slavery if it's not allowed. The Free Soil Party was a mixture of several different parties. They nominate Martin Van Buren. They wanted to abolish slavery when possible, but believed heavily in the Wilmot Proviso and had the slogan of free soil, free labor, free speech, and free men. So, y'all, they do believe in abolition when it's possible. They're not going to go, again, places in what we would consider the Deep South, they're not going to go in there and try to abolish slavery in places like Mississippi and Alabama and Virginia, Georgia, South Carolina. Like, they're not trying to go in and abolish slavery in places like that, even Louisiana. But in places where they could stop it from spreading, places maybe that, maybe slavery isn't as strong as it once was, yeah, maybe we can get rid of it there, right? Free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men was ultimately their slogan, okay? Now, overall, they did not win, as Taylor won the electoral votes 163 to 127 over Cass, and both the Whigs and Democrats continue to be major parties. So, y'all, the Free Soilers don't make a big stand here, but they're notable. They have a former president as their nominee, so that we're seeing major attention for them, but ultimately they're not going to make a major stand. Zachary Taylor is going to win. He's the war hero. So, yeah, we see the momentum of the war going to the war hero in Zachary Taylor, not the party that won the war in the Democrats. Zachary Taylor runs. He's going to win. Again, 163 to 127. Now, you don't have to really know the numbers, but just kind of give you an idea of where it's at. Okay? So, y'all, that was 1848. What do we know happens in 1849? California Gold Rush, right? That's why the San Francisco football team is known as the San Francisco 49ers, because of all the people who went out to San Francisco in 1849, right? Yeah, we're learning all about football teams. The Minnesota Vikings, because of the Scandinavian history in Minnesota, right? The San Francisco 49ers here, because gold is going to be discovered in 48, and 80,000 people are going to go to California in 1849. What we're going to see is a lot of people had been matriculating west. Like, I go here, then you go here, then you go here, playing like leapfrog, like little kids, right? So here, and then here, and then here. What happens is that now we're going to see people go, well, I was here, I'm going to go all the way over here. I'm just going to jump all this stuff in the middle, okay? So, let's look at it. In 1848, gold was discovered in California. Then people from across the world would hear about it and flock to California. During 1849, over 80,000 people reached California. But the people who came were often reckless. They were almost all men. They set up mining towns and camps that had very little law and order. Between this ruthlessness and disease, California was a dangerous place. In the first 6 months of arrival, 20% of people died. Okay? You know, what we're seeing is that we get mining camps, we get boom towns and ghost towns, we get these little mining camps. People are finding gold in various places. Well, what are you going to do? You're going to you find gold in this little creek, you're going to camp out right next to that creek. Well, let's say you leave some stuff in your little tent, your little makeshift tent that you made out of your wagon. Well, somebody comes by, they see that, they're going to go rummage through your stuff. Well, you come back and you catch them, or you find out who went through your stuff. Then what? It's like them breaking into your car, breaking into your house. Maybe you were keeping the gold you found in your wagon. So now there's going to be conflict, there's going to be anger, there's going to be violence. Or maybe you're out there and you keep the gold on you because you don't want to leave it just anywhere. You're going to keep it on you. And now a group of men come up behind you, they surround you, and hey, they tell you to hand over the gold or they're going to kill you. Right? So we see all sorts of violence. We also see tons of racism. You know? Racism and hatred also ran wild in the area. The Mexicans and Native Americans are already there. Mexicans and Native Americans had found gold much before white Americans did. But once white Americans go over, then they start flooding the region, right? So Mexicans, Native Americans had found gold here. They're using it. Now white Americans figure out that this is here. Eventually the Chinese figure out that gold is in California. They start moving to California, right? So we have all of these different groups. Racism is really going to play a role because let's be honest, white Americans are going to believe that remember, manifest destiny. We need to conquer the continent. This is our territory. Well, remember, y'all, just a couple years earlier, that land was Mexican. Just a couple, just years before that, for ages, it had been what? Native American land. Now we have white Americans coming in. Now we have Chinese immigrants coming in. There's going to be a lot of conflict over who the land is for, who the gold is for, regardless of who discovered it, regardless of who's holding it, right? And we see all of that playing out. There's going to be a ton of racism, a ton of violence, all of these things. And again, y'all remember, not all of the violence is race related, but there will be some. But we have all of these things that are playing out. Now, when we talk about California's statehood, what we see is that with the huge influx of people coming into California, it was ready to apply for statehood really quickly. Remember, all of this western states, like past the Mississippi River, they were kind of gradually coming in. More people would move to this state. Again, that kind of trickle down mentality. What happens is that now, like a waterfall of people flood into California. And remember, once a state reached met certain criteria, which part of it was based on population, well, with these 80,000 people showing up in California in 1 year, it's ready for statehood really quickly. Okay, so it's ready to apply for statehood really quickly, but we still have the issue of slavery in these areas, and it will upset the balance again. Okay, big issue is, are we going to allow slavery? Because that we have a balance of free and slave states. Okay? The people of California already made a government that was anti-slavery, so Zachary Taylor supports them and wants to get them into the Union. But this doesn't happen because things are complicated. Again, one complicating factor is simply California is a very big state, right? Part of California is above the 3630 line. Part of California is below. So if we just went with the 3630 line, how do we do that? Do we create two states? How do we make it work? Do we have Northern California and Southern California? All those things are issues that people start to talk about. Zachary Taylor, what we see is that California already had a government. It was anti-slavery. Zachary Taylor is just simply thinking, how can we get this state into the Union as quickly and easily as possible? Well, they already have a government. Let's work with that. That government is anti-slavery. No big deal. And notice that. Y'all remember, Zachary Taylor is a guy who has connections to the South, is a slave owner, and yet he's still ultimately going to support in a free state coming into the Union. Like, it's not a big deal to him because he wants to get the state in the Union, but it's a very big deal to many other people. Okay? So we're going to need help. That means we're going to need a compromise, right? Other issues that made California statehood problematic were the issue of slavery in Washington, D.C. Texas has claimed to more land in New Mexico. Basically, Texas is claiming that the border that they currently have with New Mexico, Texas actually has more land. They're saying, Texas is saying the border is here, New Mexico is saying the border's here, right? Like, Texas saying our border goes all the way to here, and New Mexico saying, nah, the border's really over here. So this area in between is ultimately being debated. So it's more than just California. And the slavery in D.C. is this thing of like, our nation was, all men are created equal, yet we're still allowing slavery and the slave trade in our nation's capital. Okay? Now that's going to lead to the great debate. Three major people play a role in Congress, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John Calhoun. All three of these men will get up and simply put forth great speeches and great arguments for their side, right? So what we see is that first up is Henry Clay, and in his usual fashion, he came up with a compromise to try to fix the issue. And in proposing his idea, he gave a magnificent speech. So Clay comes up with this great compromise. He gives a wonderful speech. He's very eloquent with it. And ultimately, what was in Clay's compromise? Okay, he wanted to admit California as a free state. Y'all notice almost all of these things are going to be give one, take one, give one, take one, right? So admit California as a free state, but there would be no slavery restrictions in the rest of the Southwest. Slavery could go on as it wanted to in, say, the New Mexico area, what would eventually become Arizona. Maybe we look at some more stuff in Texas, right? So, California's free, but no restrictions on slavery in the rest of the Southwest. We would deny Texas new land, but we would compensate Texas with debt. So we would deny the new land, like Texas, no, your borders, you don't get the bigger land, but in return we'll give you some debt relief. Like we took away some of Texas's debt. So deny new land to Texas, but compensate them with debt relief. Then we see we'll keep slavery in D.C., but abolish the slave trade in Washington, D.C. So if you're in D.C., you can still own slaves, but you can't trade. You can't have the big slave markets and slave trading situations in D.C. Okay? Then we would get a Fugitive Slave Act. I'll talk more about that in a minute. We get a Fugitive Slave Act. And deny congressional authority to interfere with the interstate slave trade. So we would create the Fugitive Slave Act, and we would deny Congress. Like Congress couldn't regulate the interstate slave trade. Remember, We say anything that goes between two states is ultimately regulated by Congress. Well, here, the Southerners are arguing like, well, you Northerners shouldn't be able to decide what happens in our slave states. And so that's what we see happening. Okay? Create the Fugitive Slave Act, which I'll talk about more in a minute, and no congressional interference on the slave trade. Okay, so that's Clay. That's what Clay comes up with. That's what Clay talks about. Now, next up is going to be Calhoun. Calhoun is actually sick with tuberculosis, so he could only write his ideas and have a friend read them. He condemned Clay's compromise and Taylor's idea that slavery should not be an issue in the new territories. He says that the South and slavery would need to be accepted or the Union would fall. Now again, Calhoun is sick with tuberculosis. He can't get up and give this speech, but he writes his ideas down and has a friend relay them. And it's really interesting because he's so right on so many levels, but he's so wrong. He's saying slavery in the South need to be accepted. Why? Like, why does slavery need to be accepted? He's obviously wrong on that. But he's dead on when he says if we don't accept the South and slavery as it is now, then the Union's going to fall. And he was right in that, y'all. Ultimately, not accepting people not being okay with the spread of slavery and the existence of slavery led the Union to fall, led to the Civil War. So it's really interesting in how Calhoun is so wrong, yet so right. It's pretty interesting in that regard. But then we get Daniel Webster. And he gave a speech that walked the middle path. He said slavery was already determined by things like the Missouri Compromise, so everyone should relax and understand that it can be settled quickly. So here we have Clay trying to come up with a new compromise. Clay is like, oh, okay, well, we can make this work. We can make Southern slave owners happy. We can make anti-slavery people happy too. We can make a compromise. John Calhoun gets up and is basically like, no, that's crap. Y'all just need to accept slavery. Accept it as it is. Move on. He says that how can Taylor sit back and say it doesn't matter? Obviously it matters. If you're going to tell me I can't take my slaves there, again, going back to those Calhoun resolutions, you're denying me of my property. That is not allowed. According to the Constitution, that's what Calhoun is saying. But then Webster gets up and says, yo, why are we fighting? We decided this 20, 30 years ago. We decided with the Missouri Compromise of 1820, right, of the 1820s that, look, well, everything above, there's no slavery above the 3630 line. If it's below it, you can have slaves, right? Like, it's that simple. Why are we arguing over the same thing yet again? That's what Daniel Webster is going to say, okay? Now, some people will try to use Clay's compromise, okay? They put all of the ideas into one bill, but Zachary Taylor says he'll veto it, and many people support him. So, y'all, what we see is that some people try to put Clay's ideas, Clay's compromise, all into one big bill and pass it. Well, y'all, nobody, not enough people like all of that bill. Think about all the things that help slave owners, anti-slavery people, and abolition people were against. Anything that was anti-slavery, all the Southerners hated, right? So how do we get it to pass? So Taylor's not supportive of it, but ultimately, his support doesn't matter. Taylor, I have that in the slide right there. Taylor's not supportive, but it's not important. Why? Because he dies. Okay? Taylor dies, and his VP, Millard Fillmore, takes over. And unlike Taylor, he was a career politician. So Fillmore has no problem with this big compromise type of scenario. Okay? So what we see is that, Taylor was a military guy, right? Right and wrong, black and white. We see it like that. We don't see all these gray areas, yada, yada, yada. Well, Millard Fillmore, Taylor's going to die in office. Millard Fillmore's going to come in. He's going to take control. He's a career politician. Ultimately, he sees like, look, yeah, well, I scratch your back, you scratch mine. That's the way politics works, right? So, he has no problem with it. Now, Stephen Douglas of Illinois will come to the rescue of the compromise. Stephen Douglas of Illinois will come to the rescue of the compromise. He splits it into individual bills and gets support for each from different areas. And finally, in September of 1850, it was settled. So, y'all, it's going to take a while. But Clay's compromise will become known as the Compromise of 1850. And it's ultimately successful because Stephen Douglas. Go back to when we were in class, right? When we were meeting face to face. imagine if, I think there were like 6 rows in that room. Well, I couldn't get 4 rows to prove that big long list of 8 or 10 things it was, right? There's no way I could get 4 rows to pass that. But I might get 4 rows to pass the first one. And then I'd get 2 of those rows and the 2 that didn't pass the first one to pass the second one, right? Pulling different areas. Again, basically think about it like this. Every bill I got, Stephen Douglas is able to get support from different regions, okay? So ultimately, he's able to pass all of the issues on the Compromise of 1850, but not all at once. He has to do it piecemeal, individual bills, and by September of 1850, all of them are passed and everything's settled. Now, I told you we would talk more about that Fugitive Slave Act. Ultimately, it's going to get passed thanks to Stephen Douglas. But what exactly did it say? Southerners wanted a way to go into the North to get their escaped slaves and bring them back. Some slaves were escaping through various means, in particular the Underground Railroad. They're escaping to places in the North. Southern slave owners know this, and they want to be able to go in and capture them. But if that escaped slave is in a free state, well then, in essence, aren't they free? How can a slave owner from Virginia go into New York and take a slave and say, this is my slave, and bring him back, right? They didn't have the legal grounds to do that. So that's what the Fugitive Slave Act did. Southerners wanted a way to go into the North and get their escaped slaves and bring them back. The Fugitive Slave Act required Northerners, another part to it, y'all, is that it required Northerners to help federal marshals if requested. Okay, y'all. So now we see people in the North who are helping slaves escape, and if a federal marshal comes up to them and asks them to help find an escaped slave, they were required by law to help. Now this is crazy. So we have people in the North who are anti-slavery, but they're being forced to help find escaped slaves and return them back to slavery. This scared blacks because now some who were never slaves were fraudulently accused, and so many of them will flee to Canada. This only upsets anti-slavery people even more. What we see happening here is that maybe you've heard of the person Solomon Northup, right? If you've ever seen the movie or read the book 12 Years a Slave, something like this kind of happens to him. Okay, Solomon Northup is tricked. Solomon Northup was a free man, was a free black man in New York. He gets tricked by some people to go down to Washington, D.C., and there he's drugged and ultimately sold into slavery when he was a free man. So that scenario is a little different, but black Americans are scared of that. And not just people who were escaped slaves, but free blacks in the North are like, what's going to stop some, in essence, bounty hunter coming to the North looking for somebody who looks like me? And how many times you say, oh, well, they all look alike, right? You've heard that, You've probably heard that about every racial and ethnic group in the history of humanity, right? There's somebody who said, oh, white people look alike, oh, black people look alike, oh, Native Americans look alike, right? Like, you've heard those phrases. So now we see this mentality of, what's the chances that somebody's going to falsely accuse you, a free black in the North, of being a slave? And that you escaped and that they're going to take you down south, right? So that scares a lot of people. And again, this just further upsets all of the anti-slavery people. Anybody who is against slavery, whether they were an abolitionist or they were anti-slavery, all people who are against slavery are really upset by this Fugitive Slave Act. Okay? Now, we get the election of 1852. Okay? The Democrats chose Franklin Pierce. Okay? Democrats are going to choose Franklin Pierce. He's from New Hampshire. He fought in the Mexican War, and he had a little bit of experience. Okay? He believed in abiding by the ideas of the Compromise of 1850. Okay? Real simple there. The Whigs, they choose Winfield Scott. He's also a war hero. He's a Virginia native, but he was known for his anti-slavery and nativist ideas. That's going to hurt his party, and Pierce is going to win. So, Winfield Scott is from Virginia, so he's a Southerner, but he's anti-slavery. He's also against immigrants. Well, how are you going to win the South if you're against slavery, and how are you going to win the North if you're if you have a lot of nativist ideas, like you don't like immigrants, right? How are you going to win? So those things really hurt Winfield Scott, and ultimately the Democrats and Franklin Pierce are going to win. It's really funny, y'all. Pierce and the Democrats here have one of the worst campaign slogans ever, y'all. I love to laugh at things. Y'all, there are some things in history that are awe-inspiring and incredible, and there are some things that we just sit back and like, really? That's pathetic. They have one of the worst. Like, it's the best in that it's so bad, but they have one of the best bad campaign slogans of all time. Okay. The Democrats in Paris use this. We polked you in 1844, because the Democrats won with polk in 1844. We shall pierce you in 52. We polked you in 1844. We shall pierce you in 1852. Yo, that's bad. It's awesome, but it's bad. Anyway, like I said, Pierce is going to win, but it turns out that his own party will start to dislike him. Many people feel like he tried to accommodate everyone and he couldn't keep the party together. Y'all, we've heard the old phrase, when you try to please everyone, you please no one, right? So Pierce wins, but ultimately he's not popular because he tries to make everybody happy. He tries to please everybody. And in trying to be nice and please everyone, ultimately he pleases no one. He makes nobody happy and he becomes very much unpopular. Okay? Y'all, this is going to be a long chapter. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here, and we will resume with part 2 of this video in a bit. So I'm going to stop the recording here. So this will be chapter 16, part 1. We will do part 2 in a bit.